The night over Tokyo was calm, too calm. Then the sky began to hum, not explosions, not sirens, a deep, steady sound, hundreds of engines moving as one. By the time Japan understood what was coming, 334 American B-29 bombers were already over the city, and Japan's dream of controlling its own skies was about to burn forever. March 9, 1945. Just before midnight, Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura climbed into his fighter under dim lights that barely cut through the darkness. The metal beneath his hands felt cold, lifeless. The cockpit smelled of oil, fuel, and something worse, fear. He didn't speak out loud. Tokyo slept behind him. Ahead, somewhere beyond the black water of Tokyo Bay, something massive was moving closer. Radar reports had been confused at first, then terrified. Too many signals, too close together, too low. This wasn't another small raid. This was something else. As Hiroshi strapped in, officers whispered instead of shouted. That alone told him everything. Men who had survived years of war didn't whisper unless the situation was already slipping out of their control. The radio crackled. Enemy aircraft approaching. Estimated strength, more than 300. 300. Even saying the number felt wrong. For months, American bombers had attacked from high above, safe in thin air where Japanese fighters struggled to climb. But tonight, the reports didn't match the past. The Americans weren't high. They were coming in low, shockingly low, barely 7,000 feet, low enough to fight, low enough to kill, and yet no one could explain why. Hiroshi pushed the throttle forward. His engine coughed, hesitated, then caught. The sound wasn't strong. It never was anymore. The fuel burned dirty. The gauges shook like nervous hands. He remembered when his aircraft had been new, when it climbed hard and fast, when it felt alive. That version of the war was gone. The runway lights were blacked out. Ground crew waved him forward with flashlights covered in cloth. Other fighters struggled beside him, engines sputtering, props refusing to turn, mechanics praying quietly as they worked. Japan didn't lack courage, it lacked time. Hiroshi lifted into the night sky, wheels retracting as the darkness swallowed him. Almost immediately he saw it, a glow on the horizon. Not fire, not yet, a reflection. Moonlight sliding across metal, hundreds of aircraft. The sound reached him, next blow, endless, like thunder that never broke. The closer he flew, the heavier it became, pressing against his chest, vibrating through the cockpit. This was no normal formation. It stretched across the sky like a moving city. Hiroshi climbed, straining his tired engine. The bomber stream came into view, and for a moment his mind struggled to accept what his eyes were seeing. B-29 Superfortresses, so many that counting them felt pointless. They flew steady, perfect spacing, no weaving, no nervous movement, just a slow, unstoppable advance toward Tokyo. He had faced B-29s before. Every Japanese pilot had. They were faster, higher, stronger than anything Japan could field. But tonight was different. They were low. For the first time in months, Hiroshi felt something dangerous. Hope. At this altitude, even worn-out Japanese fighters could reach them. Their engines were exposed, their bellies vulnerable. Pilots had begged for this chance, but as Hiroshi closed in, that hope began to rot. Beneath the bombers, their bomb bay doors were open. What hung inside was unmistakable. Incendiaries. Not bombs meant for factories or airfields. These were designed for homes, for streets, for wooden cities. At this height, they weren't planning precision. They were planning fire. Tokyo wasn't the target. Tokyo was the fuel. Hiroshi tightened his straps. His breathing slowed, forced calm over panic. Training took over. Head-on attack. Dive fast. Fire early. Break away if you survive. He rolled his fighter, nose down. The lead bomber growing larger in his gun sight. The B-29 looked unreal huge, smooth, glowing faintly in the moonlight. 4 engines burned steady orange, uncaring. At 800 yards, Hiroshi opened fire. His cannons thundered. Tracers streaked forward. Then the night turned against him. Fire came from everywhere, not just the tail. not just the waist. From above, below, both sides, front, streams of tracer curved toward him as if pulled by strings. His aircraft shuddered, warning lights flared, metal screamed. Hiroshi pulled hard, forcing the fighter into a violent turn. The fire followed him, too fast, pulled hard, forcing the fighter into a violent turn. The fire followed him, too fast, too perfect. No human gunner could react like that. 3 seconds, Vic. That was all the time he spent inside the bomber's defensive reach. 3 seconds, and his aircraft was nearly destroyed. He broke away, gasping, hands shaking as he fought to steady the plane. Ahead of him, another Japanese fighter charged in. The bombers responded instantly. Every turret turned. The fighter vanished in a flash of flame. Hiroshi's stomach dropped. This wasn't luck. This wasn't skilled gunners. This was something else. He climbed, heart pounding, watching the bombers march forward untouched. Not one had broken formation. Not one slowed. Below them, the first fires began. Small at first, then spreading. Tokyo ignited. The truth hit Hiroshi slowly, then all at once. These bombers weren't being defended by men reacting to danger. They were being defended by a system. A memory surfaced, an old lecture years ago. Talk of American experiments, remote-controlled turrets. Guns aimed not by muscle and instinct, but by machines that calculated angles, speed, distance. At the time, no one believed it. Now, Hiroshi had flown into it. Inside each B-29 was a mechanical brain gears, relays, electronics connecting every gun into a single network. When one turret saw a target, they all knew. When one fired, the others adjusted. The bomber didn't react, it predicted. Japanese fighters were attacking one aircraft. The B-29s were fighting as one mind. Hiroshi tried again, dropping beneath the formation. Smoke climbed past him as Tokyo burned brighter. The city below looked like a living wound, red, orange, spreading without control. He climbed into the bomber's blind spot, if it even existed. For a heartbeat, his shots struck home. Metal tore away. He had hit one. Then the turret turned. 2 seconds. That was all it took. Rounds ripped into his wing. Fuel sprayed. Controls went soft. The cockpit filled with the smell of gasoline and burning wire. Hiroshi fought the aircraft, barely holding it together. Around him, Japanese fighters fell one by one, swallowed by fire and smoke. The bombers kept going. Perfect lines, perfect spacing. Unstoppable. By the time Hiroshi limped back toward the coast, he knew. This wasn't a battle for air control. That dream had already died. Japan wasn't losing because its pilots lacked courage. Japan was losing because the war had changed, and it hadn't. And above the burning capital, 334 B-29s proved it beyond any doubt. The fires below Tokyo did not fade. They multiplied. From 8,000 feet, Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura watched the city change shape. Streets disappeared first, then entire neighborhoods melted into one endless sheet of flame. Smoke rose so thick it looked solid, climbing higher until it touched the bellies of the passing bombers. The B-29s did not hurry. They did not turn away. They simply continued, wave after wave, as if the burning city beneath them was nothing more than a map marking a completed task. Hiroshi struggled to keep his wounded fighter level. The control stick felt loose, wrong. Every movement came with a delay, as if the aircraft was deciding whether it still wanted to obey him. Fuel pressure hovered near zero. The engine ran rough, uneven, coughing like a dying animal. His radio crackled, fragments of voices, screams, half-sentences cut short, someone shouting that his guns were jammed, someone else yelling that he was on fire, then silence. The channel filled with static. Ground control tried to restore order, but there was none left to give. The intercept had collapsed into chaos within minutes. Fighters rose individually or in pairs, attacked blindly, and vanished just as fast. Hiroshi looked back toward the bomber stream. Not one American aircraft had broken formation. That fact weighed heavier than the damage to his plane. He had trained his entire life for air combat tangles, speed, surprise, courage under fire. Tonight, none of it mattered. Every lesson belonged to another era. He banked away, descending toward the coastline. The burning wind from the city battered his aircraft. Hot air pushing against damaged wings. Below him, rivers reflected orange, their surfaces broken by falling debris and burning fragments drifting down like embers from the sky. This was not destruction from bombs alone. It was weather. A man-made storm. By the time Hiroshi reached Norimasu Airfield, the runway glowed faintly red from the reflection of Tokyo's flames. Mechanics and medics ran toward him as his fighter slammed down in a rough landing, skidding sideways before stopping in a cloud of smoke. The engine died with a final shudder. Hiroshi climbed out slowly, legs shaking. His aircraft looked like something dragged from a scrapyard. Holes peppered the fuselage, control cables hung loose, fuel dripped onto the concrete. A mechanic stared at the damage and whispered, "How did you live?" Hiroshi didn't answer. He didn't know. Around him, other fighters never returned. Empty revetments stood silent. Of the planes that had launched with him, only one more limped back. The rest were gone. Officers gathered near the operations hut, faces lit by lanterns and distant fire. Radios spat numbers that made no sense at first, then became impossible to ignore. More than 100 Japanese fighters lost in less than 2 hours, most destroyed before firing more than a few bursts. American losses were spoken softly, almost with disbelief. 14 B-29s, 14 out of more than 300. Tokyo, meanwhile, was burning into nothing. As Hiroshi sat on an ammunition crate, a medic wrapped his arm where shrapnel had cut through his flight suit. He barely felt it. His eyes stayed fixed on the sky. Another wave of bombers passed overhead. No interceptors rose to meet them. There was nothing left to send. For the first time since the war began, the sky above the capital belonged entirely to the enemy. As dawn approached, the fires did not die. They fed on collapsed houses, on factories, on shelters packed with civilians who had nowhere to run. Wind pulled the flames together, turning thousands of separate fires into a single moving wall. Later estimates would struggle to count the dead. That night, numbers stopped meaning anything. Inside the operations hut, senior officers tried to explain what had happened. Some blamed fuel shortages, others blamed inexperienced pilots. A few insisted the attack had been unlucky, that next time would be different. Hiroshi said nothing. He knew better. He had seen the guns move. He had felt the fire follow him through impossible turns. This was not a problem of courage or skill. It was a problem of time, and Japan was already out of it. In the days that followed, the pattern repeated. B-29s came again and again, sometimes at night, sometimes by day, sometimes high, sometimes low, always protected by that same unseen intelligence guiding their guns. Japanese commanders scrambled for answers. New tactics were ordered: frontal mass attacks, night ambushes, climbing attacks from above, even ramming. Pilots were told to close their eyes and hold steady if necessary. None of it worked. The moment fighters entered the bomber stream, the response was instant. Traces converged with the same cold accuracy every time. Approaches that had once been dangerous were now suicidal. The bombers didn't need to see the fighter clearly. They only needed to calculate it. Factories across Japan worked day and night to produce replacements, but there were no engines left that ran clean. No fuel pure enough to deliver full power. No trained pilots left to fly what little could be built. New pilots arrived at the front with barely 10 hours in the cockpit. Most died on their first mission. Hiroshi was ordered back into the air repeatedly, flying patched aircraft held together by scavenged parts. Each mission felt heavier than the last, not because of fear, but because of certainty. He already knew how it would end. Week by week, cities vanished. Wooden neighborhoods ignited like dry grass. Industrial districts burned just as easily. The bombers came in streams so long they blocked out the sun or turned night into a glowing red dawn. American crews flew with confidence now. They trusted the machines guarding them. They trusted the system. Japan had no answer. The dream of air control. The belief that fighters could defend the homeland. That courage could balance industry collapse completely. By summer, the air war no longer resembled a contest, it was execution. Hiroshi's squadron dissolved quietly. No ceremony, no final order. Aircraft stopped arriving. Fuel delivery slowed, then stopped. Pilots were reassigned to ground duties or told to wait. Most never flew again. On one of his last nights at Narimasu, Hiroshi stood alone at the edge of the runway. The sky was clear. Stars shone faintly above the haze. Far to the south, a distant hum returned. Even now, he watched the bombers pass high overhead, untouched, unchallenged. Their navigation lights blinked calmly, almost peacefully. For a moment, he imagined what it must feel like inside one of those aircraft, warm, pressurized, protected by machines that never slept, never hesitated. Then he looked back at the empty revetments behind him and understood the final truth. Japan did not lose the sky in one night. But on March 9, 1945, 334 B-29s over Tokyo made the outcome unavoidable. They didn't just burn a city, they erased the future Japan had hoped to defend. By the summer of 1945, the sky above Japan no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a ceiling low, heavy, and completely out of reach. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura sensed it every time he looked up. The sound of engines no longer triggered urgency or readiness. It triggered resignation. When American bombers appeared, there was no scramble, no shouting orders, no rush toward aircraft that might still fly. Men simply watched. The war in the air had moved beyond them. What haunted Hiroshi most was not the fire, or the losses, or even the fear. It was the silence that followed. After each raid, there were fewer radios crackling, fewer voices calling for help, fewer aircraft returning with engines coughing and wings shredded. The airfields grew quieter, emptier. Rows of revetments that once sheltered fighters now held nothing but oil stains and memories. The B-29s kept coming. Sometimes they arrived at night, glowing faintly against the darkness. Other times they came in daylight, silver shapes cutting across a blue sky that Japan no longer controlled. Their formations were precise, disciplined, almost calm. They did not rush. They did not scatter. They behaved like something that had already won and was simply finishing the work. Hiroshi watched younger pilots study the sky with forced confidence. Many had never fired their guns in combat. Some had barely learned how to land without breaking their aircraft. They asked questions Hiroshi could not answer honestly. How close should we get? Which angle works best? How do you survive the turrets? He wanted to tell them the truth, that there was no safe angle anymore, that the bomber saw them before they committed to the attack. That courage alone no longer closed the distance. But he said nothing. Taking that belief from them felt worse than lying. The Americans had not just built a bomber, they had built a system. Every B-29 was a node in a larger machine guided by radar, protected by mathematics, supplied by factories that never slept. The aircraft were not isolated targets, they were parts of a moving network that anticipated danger and erased it before it fully formed. Japan, by contrast, fought as individual pilots, individual machines, individual acts of bravery against something collective and relentless. That imbalance grew wider with each passing week. Reports from across the country told the same story. Osaka burned. Kobe burned. Nagoya burned. Cities that had stood for centuries vanished in hours. Firestorms fed themselves, pulling in wind strong enough to knock people off their feet. Rivers boiled. Asphalt melted. The bombers flew through it all without pause. Hiroshi remembered his first years as a pilot, when intercepts felt like contests, when outmaneuvering an enemy mattered, when the sky still rewarded skill. Now the sky rewarded preparation, coordination, and machines that thought faster than humans could react. Even when Japanese fighters managed to reach the bombers, the result was almost always the same. Defensive fire met them instantly. Approaches that once took seconds now lasted fractions of a moment. Pilots described the experience with the same words over and over. It felt like the bomber was waiting for me. It moved its guns before I moved my plane. I never even saw where the fire came from." Those who survived rarely tried again. Commanders demanded solutions that no longer existed. New instructions arrived daily, each more desperate than the last. Attack from below. Attack from above. Attack in groups. Attack alone. Ram if necessary. Die if necessary. Many did, but none changed the outcome. Fuel shortages became crippling. Even when aircraft were available, there was often nothing to put in their tanks. Engines failed on takeoff. Fighters crashed before reaching altitude. Mechanics worked miracles with scrap parts, but miracles ran out faster than enemy bombers. Training collapsed under the pressure. Schools shortened courses to weeks, then days. Pilots were sent into combat without ever firing live ammunition. Some had never flown at night. The sky swallowed them quickly. Hiroshi began to feel like a relic, one of the last witnesses to a kind of air war that no longer existed. Younger pilots looked at him with a mix of respect and disbelief, as if he came from a different world. He felt it too. The war had accelerated past him, leaving only aftermath. One evening, after another raid had passed unchallenged, Hiroshi walked along the edge of the airfield. The smell of smoke lingered in the air, carried from a city miles away. Even now, it never fully left. The land itself seemed burned into memory. Above him, the sky was quiet. That frightened him more than the bombers ever had. Silence meant helplessness. Silence meant acceptance. He thought back to March 9th, to the moment hope briefly returned when the bombers flew low, to the instant it died when the guns answered with impossible precision. That night had not just destroyed Tokyo, it had destroyed belief. The belief that Japan could still adapt, still respond, still find a way to fight back. The Americans had crossed the line that night. They had shown what modern war truly looked like, not hero against hero, but system against system, industry against exhaustion, calculation against instinct. Japan's dream of air control had been built on pilots, on courage, on sacrifice. America's was built on machines that never tired. By July, even senior officers spoke openly of the inevitable. The air defenses were no longer defenses at all. They were gestures, symbols meant to preserve honor, not stop bombers. Everyone understood this, even if few said it aloud. When news reached Hiroshi of cities reduced to ash in a single night, he stopped feeling shock. Shock required surprise, and there was nothing left to surprise him. The pattern was clear, the outcome already written. The sky belonged to the B-29. One afternoon, Hiroshi was called to observe a briefing. An officer pointed at maps covered in red markings. Each mark represented a burned district, a destroyed factory, a vanished neighborhood. The red spread so wide it was difficult to find unmarked space. "This," the officer said quietly, "is what air superiority looks like." No one argued. Hiroshi returned to the runway afterward and watched a lone training aircraft struggle into the air, engines sputtering, barely climbing. It reminded him of his own flight on March 9th, of pushing a tired machine towards something it was never meant to defeat. He wondered how many more would try, how many more would die learning what he already knew. The B-29s were not invincible, but they were untouchable in practice. Their losses were acceptable. Their crews rotated, rested, replaced. Japan could not do the same. Every fighter lost was a wound that never healed. This was the quiet truth behind the Firestorms, not just destruction, but imbalance. A war where one side could absorb loss and the other could not. As summer deepened, rumors spread of new American weapons, of even greater power. Hiroshi did not know if they were true. He only knew they were unnecessary. The war in the air had already been decided. When he looked back on his career, he no longer measured it by victories or missions. He measured it by the moment the sky stopped responding to him, the moment the enemy became something he could not reach. For Japan, that moment had arrived over Tokyo beneath the wings of 334 bombers, and nothing after could change it. The war did not end with a single order or a sudden silence in the sky. It ended in layers, slowly pressing down on everyone who lived beneath the bombers. By late July 1945, Japan existed under a constant expectation of destruction. Every clear night felt dangerous. Every calm morning felt borrowed. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura no longer counted days by missions. He counted them by cities that no longer existed. The reports came in quietly now, almost routinely. Another urban center burned. Another industrial district erased. Another population displaced or dead. The numbers were spoken without emotion because emotion had been exhausted long ago. When everything is catastrophic, nothing feels sudden anymore. The B-29s had turned the sky into a one-way road. Hiroshi noticed how people reacted when the distant hum began. Early in the war, sirens caused panic. People ran, shouted, searched for shelter. Now, many simply looked up. Some didn't move at all. They had learned what movement could and could not change. This was the true weight of air control, not just physical destruction, but psychological surrender that came from knowing there was no defense left to trust. Airfields across Japan reflected that same reality. Once busy runways stood cracked and empty. Grass grew where aircraft had once been parked wingtip to wingtip. Hangars housed broken machines cannibalized beyond recognition. Mechanics worked more out of habit than hope. Pilots gathered in small groups, speaking quietly. Not about tactics anymore, but about families, memories, places they feared no longer existed. The sky was no longer their domain. It had become something distant, owned by others. Hiroshi often thought back to his training days, to instructors who spoke of air superiority as a contest of will and skill, to diagrams that showed interception curves and firing angles. Those lessons felt ancient now, like teachings from a vanished civilization. The Americans had rewritten the meaning of air power. It wasn't just the bombers themselves, it was everything behind them. Radar coverage that reached far beyond Japan's shores, logistics that ensured fuel, spare parts, and trained crews were always available. Factories that replaced losses faster than Japan could even measure them. The B-29 was not an aircraft operating alone. It was the visible tip of something enormous and unstoppable. Japan had built fighters to protect its skies. America had built an entire system to take them away. Hiroshi saw this truth clearly one afternoon while reviewing after-action summaries. The data was blunt. Interceptions attempted. Aircraft lost. Bombers damaged. Cities destroyed. The ratio never changed in Japan's favor. No adjustment, no new order, no heroic sacrifice altered the outcome. The Americans adapted faster than Japan could react. When fighters attacked at night, the bombers improved night coordination. When pilots tried mass attacks, the defensive fire grew denser. When ramming was attempted, losses skyrocketed without stopping the raids. Each adaptation by Japan came too late. Each adaptation by Japan came too late. Each adaptation by America arrived before the previous one was even understood. That was the real defeat. Hiroshi remembered something an older officer once said. Early in the war, the sky rewards those who prepare before the fight begins. Japan had prepared for a different fight. As August approached, the air grew heavy with rumors. Some spoke of negotiations, others dismissed them. The bombers did not slow. If anything, they came with more confidence, flying deeper, longer, with fewer losses. Entire cities were now marked as burned out. The phrase sounded almost technical, almost clean. In reality, it meant neighborhoods erased so completely that even rubble no longer told stories. Hiroshi flew once more during this period, not as an interceptor, but as an escort for a transport flight relocating personnel. His aircraft struggled to climb, the engine weak, unreliable. He scanned the sky instinctively, even though he knew no Japanese fighter would be sent to intercept anything anymore. When distant silver shapes appeared far above, his heart jumped despite himself. B-29s. They passed without changing course. They didn't need to. That moment stayed with him, the realization that the bombers no longer even acknowledged Japanese aircraft, that they had risen beyond the need to react. Air control wasn't just dominance, it was indifference. Below, the landscape bore scars everywhere, burned fields, charred city edges, roads clogged with refugees moving toward nowhere in particular. Smoke still lingered in the air days after raids, settling into clothing, skin, memory. Hiroshi landed and shut down his engine. The silence afterward felt unnatural. Engines had once filled his life. Now, silence felt permanent. He sat on the wing for a long time, watching the sky. When word finally came that new weapons had been used, weapons beyond anything previously imagined, Hiroshi was not shocked. The escalation felt inevitable. If the sky could be taken so completely, why stop there? Yet even then he understood something others missed. Those final weapons ended the war quickly. The air war had already ended it slowly. The destruction of Japan's air control had removed every other option. Without the sky, supply lines failed. Factories burned unchecked. Cities could not protect themselves. Morale collapsed not because people were weak, but because reality offered no resistance to believe in. March 9, 1945 had been the turning point. Not because it was the first firestorm, but because it revealed the truth too clearly to deny. That night proved Japan could no longer contest the air. Everything after was consequence. Hiroshi later learned more about the American system that defeated them, about the centralized fire control, the remote turrets, the calculating devices that adjusted aim faster than any human crew could react, the pressurized cabins that kept gunners alert while Japanese pilots froze at altitude. The realization did not make him angry, it made him tired. The war had not been decided by a lack of bravery, it had been decided by preparation, resources, and the willingness to abandon old ideas before they became fatal. Japan held on to its past too long. The Americans let the future fight for them. Years later, when Hiroshi tried to explain the air war to those who had not lived through it, he struggled to find the right words. How do you describe fighting something that does not feel alive? How do you explain fear when the enemy is not a pilot's face, but a system that sees you before you act? He usually settled on one sentence: we were not defeated in the air, we were surpassed. The memory of the B-29s never left him, the sound of their engines still returned in dreams, steady and endless. Not loud, not frantic, just certain. That certainty was the sound of air control being taken forever, and once it was gone, Japan had nothing left to bargain with. The sky had already decided. The war ended quietly for Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura. There was no final dogfight, no last scramble, no desperate climb into a sky already lost. It ended with an order, read in a low, steady voice, passed from officer to officer like something fragile that might break if spoken too loudly. Engines were not started. Aircraft were not armed. Men simply stood and listened. The sky above them was empty that day. Hiroshi felt something loosen in his chest when he realized it. For years, the air had been filled with threat, either incoming bombers or the expectation of them. Silence had meant vulnerability. Now silence meant something else. It meant the end. Yet the silence did not feel like peace. It felt like exhaustion finally allowed to surface. In the weeks that followed, Hiroshi walked through places that had once been familiar and now felt unreal. Streets he had known since childhood were gone. Entire neighborhoods existed only in memory. Burned foundations traced where houses had stood, bent rails marked where trams once ran. The air still carried the smell of smoke long after the fires had died. People moved slowly, quietly, not in panic, not in fear, but in shock, as if the country itself was trying to understand what had happened to it. Hiroshi understood. The war had not ended with surrender. It had ended when Japan lost control of its skies. Everything else was simply catching up. He thought often about March 9, 1945, about that moment when hope flickered as the bombers flew low and how quickly it vanished under impossible fire. That night had revealed something Japan could not undo. The enemy was no longer just faster or stronger. The enemy had changed the rules. The B-29 Superfortress was more than an aircraft. It was proof that modern war no longer belonged to individual skill alone. It belonged to coordination, calculation, and industry, working together without hesitation. Japan had placed its faith in pilots. America placed its faith in systems. When those two ideas met over Tokyo, the outcome was never in doubt. Hiroshi later learned how American crews described those missions, how they trusted their machines, their formations, their defensive fire. How many never even saw a Japanese fighter, clearly only brief flashes before the threat disappeared. To them, the sky had felt safe. To Hiroshi, that realization hurt more than the physical damage he had survived. The idea that the enemy could move through Japan's airspace with confidence without fear was the true meaning of defeat. Air control is not about shooting down aircraft. It is about deciding who gets to exist beneath the sky. Once Japan lost that, cities burned freely. Supply lines collapsed. Communication failed. Morale withered. No ground defense could compensate. No bravery could reverse it. The dream of air control had been central to Japan's strategy. Protect the homeland. Intercept the bombers. Keep the war away from civilians. The B-29s destroyed that dream in one night. 334 aircraft over Tokyo did more than burn a city. They proved that Japan could no longer defend itself from above. That knowledge spread faster than fire. Even before the final weapons were used, even before surrender was announced, the outcome had been written across the sky. Every unchallenged bomber formation, every city erased without resistance reinforced the same truth. The war was already over. Years later, Hiroshi was asked once what it felt like to face the B-29s. He did not speak of fear. He did not speak of anger. He said this: it felt like standing in front of the future and realizing you were already behind it. The future had arrived over Tokyo on March 9, 1945. It arrived with engines humming in perfect rhythm, with machines that calculated faster than men could react, with a system built not to duel but to dominate. Japan fought with courage, America fought with preparation, and in modern war, preparation decides everything. The sky chose its side that night. If you found this story powerful, consider subscribing for more WW2 history told through human experience, not just dates and numbers, but moments that change the world. Because understanding how wars are won is the first step toward understanding why they should never be fought again.